I would like to say a little bit about Ladakh because I assume most of you haven't heard about this place, and I presume none of you have ever been there. Is there anybody who has been in Ladakh? Okay, no surprise. Ladakh in Tibetan means land of high passes. A La is a high mountain pass, right? So the title of the exhibition is nothing but a translation of the word. Right? It is located in the northern parts of India. Actually, geographically speaking, is a place where India, Pakistan, and China meet, and that means trouble. Right? There have been 3 wars between Pakistan and India, plus in the Kargil War, which was a more local sort of skirmish in 1999. And furthermore, China annexed a part of Ladakh in 1962. And even as recently as a few months ago, China and India had a little problem at the border, right? So that has several implications. One, there's a huge presence of the Indian army for obvious reasons. Right? 2, Ladakh, culturally speaking, especially the eastern part of Ladakh, was really a Tibetan culture. For instance, the Ladakhi monks were often trained at a Tibetan museum. Tibet is now part of China. Right? And the border between India and China is more or less closed, and that had many implications for the trade that went through Ladakh, for the religious instruction, and many other problems that arose. The consequence is that till 1974, Ladakh was off limits to all foreigners. In 1977, I went to India, so like a round trip of India, and at the end of this round trip, I said to myself, I'm going to go to the, quote, most exotic place in India, and that was Ladakh, especially since it had been off limits to foreigners till 3 years prior to my trip. Right? And I will tell you in a moment how this trip went, but I'm first going to say a little bit more about where Ladakh is and how it became Ladakh. This is a map, a little bit hard to read. Right? The yellow area is Jammu and Kashmir. The capital is Srinagar. Right? And up there you have an area called Aksai Chin. However, this map does not show you the military and political situation, because about half of that area, this yellowish area, actually is controlled by Pakistan these days. Right? Kashmir itself is also divided into the Indian part, the larger part, and into Azad Kashmir, which sort of means free Kashmir, which is under the control of Pakistan. Right? So when we talk about borders between India and Pakistan, and even between India and China, it's usually called the line of control. That means that's the effective border right now, but the various countries all claim some piece of another country. Right? I'm not going to talk very much about politics, but it's important to keep this in mind. Right? This is still another map. Right? Again, you see the Kashmir area here. Right? The yellowish Kashmir here is under the control of Pakistan. Right? The capital of Pakistan is Islamabad, right? Not very far from Ladakh. Right? Then it says northern areas. These used to be part of Ladakh, but are now controlled by Pakistan. Right? the capital of Ladakh. See that little red plane? It says Leh, right? That's the capital of Ladakh in general, and also of what's called the Leh district, which makes up about half of Ladakh. Then you see here a city, Kargil. Kargil is a predominantly Muslim area, and the Kargil district makes up about half of Ladakh. Mostly they're Shia Muslims. Ethnically, they are Balti. They're not Kashmiri, they're Balti. I'm not going to say very much about the Kargil Shia because that's a totally different story from the story I want to tell you today. But remember, roughly half of the population of Ladakh are Muslims, and it gets too complicated to talk about all the relationships between these groups. Right. When you look at these sort of whitish looking areas, that means eternal snow. Right. The snow line in the summer is about 5,000 meters. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's higher than the highest mountain in the United States outside Alaska. Right. Leh, the capital of Ladakh, is 3,500 meters high. And if you go to the villages, you go even higher up. Right. If you look at the pictures outside, you will notice that it's either mountains or it's sort of almost like a desert. More than 99% of Ladakh is not fertile. So you can walk through Ladakh for 10 miles and not see a tree, not a single tree. It's all yellow. Then you see a little green spot, maybe a field with barley or what's called winter wheat or peas. Right? Almost certainly that field is artificially irrigated by water that ultimately comes from the glaciers. So, till the 1970s and 80s, most Ladakhis were farmers, right? Subsistence farmers. We call them peasants. A peasant is a person who mostly farms for his own family. Right, and doesn't produce for the larger market the way that American farmers do. Right? Or they might work for the army, some were little businessmen, some were monks, and so on and so on. Since then, a lot has changed, and I will later tell you what these changes are, at least very briefly. Right? The Ladakh I'm going to discuss today is basically Ladakh in 1980 and 81. I was in Ladakh on 4 occasions. First time I told you in 77. Then for 6 months in the summers of 80 and 81. And then I went back in the year 2000. And already Ladakh had changed in those 20 years dramatically. To give you an example, the population of Ladakh in 80-81 was about 140,000, plus the army. Another 100,000 or so. Right. The capital during the winter time had about 9,500 people. During the summertime, about 12,500. Now, Leh has about 35,000 people. More than 3 times the population within just a few decades. Just as an example of how dramatic these changes are. Right. I have, of course, pictures that show you Ladakh in 2000, but I thought let's be consistent. Let's look at Ladakh, how it existed in certain ways for centuries. Ladakh is about as big as Ireland, but it only has 300,000 people. And the reason for that is simple. It's called 99% mountain desert. There are only these 2 towns, Leh and Kargil. Everything else are villages, some tiny, tiny, tiny. I'm just curious, any one of you ever spent a long time in a village? Right. I used to live in a tiny village up in the Alps, which in certain ways prepared me for Ladakh. In New York, you're surrounded by man-made, human-made objects everywhere. In Ladakh, you walk 10 miles and there's no human in sight, perhaps. Right? And believe me, that makes a huge difference when it comes to your mind. Ladakh was an independent kingdom from the 9th century to the 1830s. Ruled by kings that originally came from Tibet, but later on were Ladakhi kings, and as you might guess, over the centuries, sometimes it expanded, sometimes it shrank, right? But in the 1830s, the so-called Dogra invasion occurred, which came from Kashmir and Jammu, right? Remember, it's part of Jammu and Kashmir. And from then on, Ladakh was controlled, A, by these invaders who were Muslims and some were Sikh, S-I-K-H, and because India was, after all, a colony of the Brits, right, they had a sort of a district commissioner in Leh. Right. The invaders started to control some of the trade because that's where the money was and that's what they were used to. But the daily lives of many Ladakhis wasn't that affected by this. So if you were in a little village somewhere up in the mountains, your life wasn't much different than it had been 100 years ago when Ladakh was still controlled by its own kings. In terms of religion, the two most common religions are Tibetan Buddhism, that's about half of the population, especially in the east and the Leh district. And the others are predominantly Muslim, Shia Muslims. Right? Most Muslim populations in this world are Sunni, but Iraq has a Shia population and Iran has a Shia population. So there were traditional ties between Ladakh and Iraq, because some of the Ladakhi Shia religious imams and so on were sent to Iraq to be trained there. Right? After the 1830s, when Ladakh came under the control of Jammu and Kashmir, there were not too many changes, but a couple are interesting. One, there were a number of Christian missionaries. They came from Herrnhut, which is a tiny little place in Germany on the Polish border. Right? And although they didn't convert many people, there are only about 200 Christians now in Ladakh. Some of these Christians played a big role, for instance, in the educational system. Right? And they were also among the first to write scientifically about Ladakh. So they translated the language, they created a Tibetan German dictionary, and a man called Frank was really the first big-time scientist to publish many papers on Ladakh. Right? After World War II, in 47-48, the division between Pakistan and India occurred, a bloody division. The Maharaja of Kashmir said Kashmir should be part of India, even though the large majority of the people were Muslims and weren't happy about this. Right? And ever since, Kashmir is a central problem between Pakistan and India. And remember, both of them have nuclear weapons, both of these states. In 1999, there were some very serious military incidences in Kargil, in Ladakh, right, between the Pakistani who first claimed, oh, these are freedom fighters, but they were really part of the Pakistani army, right? And the Indian army succeeded in basically throwing the Pakistani invaders out, I was in Ladakh in 2000, and there were some more incidences, and we were locked up in our hotel for 2 days because people were afraid there would be riots between the Buddhists and the Muslims. Right? So this is not the past. One more point. The world's highest battle line is on the so-called Siachen Glacier, which is in the northern corner of mostly Indian Ladakh. 6,000 meters high. Most of the people that die there, meaning soldiers, don't die because of guns or artillery. They die because they freeze to death. Or there's an avalanche rather recently in Pakistan, killed about 140 soldiers and some civilians up there. However, I'm going to leave the politics now aside, right? And we're going to talk a little bit also about languages, because language and culture obviously overlap. There's a little picture of a little boy in the exhibition. So what do the kids in Ladakh have to learn language-wise? First, at home, especially in the Leh district, they would speak Ladakhi. Ladakhi is a Tibetan dialect, but hardly understandable to a Tibetan. Right? There was no writing system for Ladakhi until about 30 years ago. Now they're trying to use a Tibetan system, right, which is difficult to do. Then we have Tibetan itself, which is mostly spoken by those monks who were trained in Tibet, because many of the sacred writings are in Tibetan, not in Ladakhi. Then we have Urdu, the national language of Pakistan, and also widely used in Kashmir. Right? Hindi, the most widely spoken language, especially in northern India. Urdu and Hindi are closely related, mutually understandable, even though the writing systems are different. Right? Then we have Kashmiri, still another language, spoken in the valley of Kashmir, Srinagar, where the capital is. Right? And then we have certain ancient languages spoken only by a very few people called Bokpa. Bokpa are quite different from Ladakhis. There are only 2 villages, at least in the Buddhist areas, where this language is used. Right. And the Bokpa also kept a very different religion from Buddhism till the last few decades, when Buddhism started to make inroads. In the exhibition, you see one woman. She's sort of shouting at somebody, right? And she has on her chest sort of these round metal silver-looking plates. She comes from there. Right? So she's not a Ladakhi in the usual sense. So the language system is extremely complicated. Furthermore, if you go to a high school in Ladakh, you're also going to learn English. Or, especially in recent decades, some of the better off students are sent to Delhi, the capital, or New Delhi, the capital of India, and there they must know English, and for practical purposes it would be very useful also to know Hindi. Right? So I think that tells you something about these complications, and I'm leaving out some other languages, right, that are spoken only by very small groups of people. I told you that in 1977 I first visited Ladakh, but only for a few days. So I will say a little bit about this trip. We flew to Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir, a beautiful town. You stay typically on a houseboat. Right? There are many stories in India that Srinagar and the valley of Kashmir are where paradise is located. Right? Then we rented a little ambassador car. to get us on the road to Leh. It's 434 kilometers, roughly 300 miles. Right? It goes through Kargil about halfway. Right? And at first you drive through the sort of like almost alpine landscape. Even the flowers look like they looked to me when I was a little boy. I recognize some of them. Right? Lots of snow in the wintertime, so it all looked familiar. Then you cross the first pass, right? And the landscape started to look more dry. Then another pass, and you felt yourself to be now in Central Asia rather than in India as such. Because you would stand on this pass, you would see this immense mountain landscape. Right? Some of the highest mountains, like the K2, is not very far from Ladakh. Right? And it would be totally dry. Right? And you could just as well be in Tibet as far as the physical appearance of the place is concerned. Right? Above you, you have this huge blue sky. The type of sky you will not see in New York ever. Right? Ladakh is quite dry. Right? So you see a few clouds floating above you. At night, you see the Milky Way in a way that you will never see anywhere in the United States, surely not in New York or thereabouts. It's unbelievable. So we met our first Ladakhis, a small group of people who were repairing the road. They invited us to share their meager, lunch, and we gave them some food, which they didn't like especially, right? We couldn't talk to them because I spoke Ladakhi. Our driver was a Kashmiri, right? So no communication. Right? But there was one special thing about this group. They were all women. I've never seen a little group of people repairing a road in any Muslim country, and I've been in at least 20 of them, right, that were women. No Kashmiri father would allow his daughter to join this. Right? In fact, in the Kashmiri part of the drive, you saw women working in the field, sometimes near the road, and they would turn their back on you because no male was supposed to look at their faces. Right. So Ladakh and Tibetan society has a different idea about women and men. Right? It's not a feminist idea. Feminism is unknown in these societies, right? At least was. Right? But there is still more equality, more freedom, and the practice of fraternal polyandry. Very few societies practice this. Right? It means that when a woman gets married, she marries the oldest brother in a given family, and if he has younger brothers, they become her husband as well. Right. So one woman, 3 husbands. Can you imagine this in Kashmir, where if anything goes the other way around, one husband, several wives? Right? Never ever. In fact, it was outlawed in 1941 because Kashmir is governed by Muslims and they couldn't stand this custom. Right? But it continued. I interviewed many people who were married that way. The younger generation is drifting away from this for economic and other reasons, right? But the custom certainly was still in existence in 1980-81. Right? So my big conclusion, I'm not in Kansas anymore. Right? So then we stayed overnight in Kargil, a rather typical Muslim town in certain ways. Right? And went to Leh, but we had a little problem. The car was an ambassador. It means probably nothing to you. It's an English car constructed somewhere, I think, in the late 1960s. And when it went out of fashion, they shipped the whole factory to India. Right? And the car had two problems. A, not very good brakes. And if there's one thing you want, is good brakes up there. Right? B, the carburetor would stop functioning every 2 or 3 miles because you're so high up that you have these little bubbles in the gas. Not good. So we would stop. The driver had a clever method to deal with this. He had sort of patches of moss. He would put it into cold water, if he could find it, and put it on the carburetor to cool it down. Right? Then we drove again, and especially if it went up, a few miles later, we stopped again. My girlfriend got really nervous. Right? Especially since it got later and later and later, and then it was 11 at night. And she thought maybe we have to stay overnight somewhere on the road. Right? It didn't bother me especially since Ladakh is one of the most peaceful societies on earth. Right? But she was skeptical. We finally arrived around midnight. So that was my first trip. And I decided, okay, I'm going to come back and do some serious business here. Serious business meant that I developed an interview plan. And in 80 and 81, I interviewed more than 70 persons in Ladakh, including children, women, men, and monks, because it's a monk society in certain ways. I'm not going to go into details about what we did, but I will tell you a couple of stories. I will say something about Ladakhi society. So here we're interviewing the Rinpoche. A Rinpoche is a recognized reincarnation, and in this case, the head of a monastery. In fact, there are a couple pictures of Phang Monastery in the exhibition. Now, interestingly enough, this Hedera Monastery, a monk, was married to the sister of my interpreter. I always had an interpreter translating between English and Ladakhi. Right? Now, usually, there are some monks that are married in Tibet as well as Ladakh, but not the head of a monastery. So I decided to ask him. Right? And I thought this will be a really interesting answer. Well, this is the answer. My yidam told me to marry or I would live a short life. A yidam is a spiritual guide. He doesn't exist, but you meditate on that figure. Right? And meditation means visualization. You visualize your yidam in every single detail. Right? And you make him appear out of your tanka, that's a sort of a painting, right? So that he appears in front of you. Right? So the yidam told them, better get married or you're going to have a short life. I thought I'm going to get a really theological answer out of this guy. No way. Right? Then I tried to ask him something about the marriage. Now, obviously, I try to be as circumspect as possible. Right? There were other monks sitting around while the head of their monastery was being interviewed. Right? And he gave an answer, and everybody started laughing. Why? Because the Ladakhi word for marriage is penis vagina. So just in case you don't know what marriage is about, I wanted to have this elaborate thought about this, not offending this, spiritual creature there, but the monks really got a kick out of this. Right? Later, I attended the so-called chum dances of his monastery, and you will see a picture towards the end. I think it's number 31 of the pictures. Right. Chum dances occur at many of the monasteries, the big ones. Right. You see the courtyard of the monastery, In the background is a monastery and a small figure in the courtyard, a monk who is, dressed up with a mask and a robe. Right? All the dancers are monks. It's a sort of morality play, danced. Right? And he's looking at a huge tanka, a wall hanging, about 3 stores high, showing a spiritual figure, a monk who really lived in the 13th century. Right? And the head of the monastery said to me, "Did you see this? This is me." The head of a monastery, a Rinpoche, is a recognized reincarnation. Right? By reincarnation doesn't mean once or twice, 3 times. It's a lineage. A lineage means going back for centuries. Right? So he said, "That's me." Right? Quite matter of fact. The guy was really matter of fact. Right? So that's an example of an interview. Here's a second interview. We interviewed actually the Tibetan head of a monastery, and he had a very good reputation. And since these heads of monasteries have quite a bit of prestige in Ladakh, you hear all sorts of stories. And of course, I would ask my interpreter and so on, tell me stories about these guys. Right? So he had a very good reputation. He was a Nyingmapa, which means a lineage that is ancient. It goes back to Padmasambhava, the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, a sort of a mystic, magical, but also historical figure, a mixture. In the exhibition, you see his 8 appearances, again towards the end. Right? All have masks on. It's the same Padmasambhava, but of course he can appear, in any number of ways. Right? Attending the dances, the chum dances, in his own honor. Okay, so I'm now interviewing this head. It was a very interview, totally different from the first Rinpoche. In fact, this head of the monastery gave me a sort of a Maslow-type self-actualization theory. Very surprising, right? He even used the term. I was really surprised. It's the only time I ever got this out of an interview with a monk, right? After an hour, he said, "I'm sorry, we have to break this off." And I had noticed that a group of peasants had come in. Each monastery has a responsibility for a group of villages. They often own land, they're responsible for the spiritual welfare, especially when the person dies, and so on and so on. So it wasn't unusual for a group of peasants to come. Right? And then he said, again, quite matter of fact, they want me to change the weather. Right? Why? Because it had been cloudy for a number of days. Clouds in Ladakh means less water. Right? Why? Because it means no sunshine on the glacier, and that means no water from the glaciers. And remember, that's where the water comes from. So I asked him, "Could you please teach me how to do this? It might come in handy." And we all laughed. They have a great sense of humor, these guys. Really, they don't get offended by this type of joke. Right? 2 days later, the sun shone, so maybe you could do it after all. And then I interviewed the Bakula Rinpoche, the most famous monk in all of Ladakh. He died in his 90s rather recently. He was especially famous because he was a politician. He knew Indira Gandhi, who happened to be in Ladakh watching chum dances when I was there. So I remember her and this Rinpoche sitting next to each other. She paid no attention whatsoever to this religious stuff. She was a rather pragmatic person. Right? I used to joke, the only politician in India was pants on, right? Because she was so tough. Right? And you got the feeling that you have an extremely wily politician in front of you, plus the head of a monastery with a very strong religious reputation. So apparently for him, those two things went together. Right? There was another Rinpoche who didn't want to be interviewed and by me, and I heard later on, he basically said, that's, you know, my job is to run this monastery, so to speak. I don't get involved in politics, and I don't get involved in these silly interviews or whatever, right? So, even though they were all heads of monasteries, even though they're all Tibetan Buddhists, right, their personalities and even their answers to certain specific religious questions I asked them were quite different. When we started the interviews, I brought in certain moral dilemmas, and I went to the best-known scholar in Ladakh and asked him whether he would be willing to translate them so we could use this. Right? He did. Then I took my interpreter, right, and we started our first interview. And after half an hour, the interpreter said, you know, this interview is written in such a complicated, highfalutin language that my interviewee, a woman, didn't really understand the questions very well. So we did it all over. I told my interpreter, you translate the stuff, you know, and maybe you're a little bit more down to earth. Right? But there's a point in this story. When you go to a monastery, or even among lay persons, you will find enormous difference in education. So these Rinpoche are trained from the age of 3. They're selected, they become recognized reincarnations around the age of 3, as did the Dalai Lama, incidentally, the most famous Buddhist monk in the world. Right? And from then on, they're taken away from the family, and they're trained in leadership, including spiritual leadership. They're among the best trained leaders in the world. I mean, how many of us are trained starting at age 3? Right? So, we're sort of interviewing these people, and I noticed the enormous differences in education between various monks. Some could not read and write. So a family would send their little boy at age 6 or 7 or 8 to the monastery, and there's a picture of several little monks sort of horsing around. Right? They don't look too unhappy. Right? And but the family of these monks is responsible for the upkeep of these budding monks. Right? And some come from very poor families. They might have to work in the fields during the summer, about 3 to 4 months summertime when all the harvest has to be done. Right? And they learn all these chants by heart. Right? But they are certainly not exposed to what you might call higher Buddhism. The Buddhism that you find in American books on Tibetan Buddhism. Right? So, some of these monks, especially the well-educated heads of the monasteries, may have meditated for years and years. Tibetan Buddhism is exceedingly complicated. Right? But other monks basically repeat these chants. You know, it's basically rote memory. Right? And they probably learn a little bit about some of the visual symbolism. Right? But other than that, they're not educated. So that is also one of the reasons why that translation of the questionnaire in the first version didn't work. Right? Now, in this case, it wasn't a monk who translated, but he was a scholarly type, right? And his way of thinking was so different from what a farmer's wife would be thinking about. My purpose in this research was not to figure out how Tibetan Buddhism works. There are lots of books on this, written by people who are fluent in Tibetan, which I'm not, right? I try to find out what religion means in the everyday life of people, including children, monks, women, men, and so on. That was really the purpose of these interviews. If you don't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, let me first of all point out that there are three major forms of Buddhism: Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, which means the Tibetan type. Hinayana is, for instance, practiced in parts of Indochina, let's say Thailand, or Sri Lanka. Right? Mahayana Buddhism would be found or was found in China and Japan and so on. And Vajrayana Buddhism is an offshoot, a sort of a Tibetan offshoot, tantric form of Buddhism of Mahayana Buddhism. Right? So I think I understand a little bit about this Vajrayana Buddhism, especially how people really practice it, but I don't claim to know very much about Zen Buddhism in Japan or so on, which is quite different in certain ways. So what do the Buddhists learn? Well, the Buddha told us that there are three major characteristics of human existence: impermanence, everything changes; suffering, sometimes called dukkha; and karmic interconnectedness of all living beings, which include not only humans and animals, but also ghosts, including so-called hunger ghosts, right, titans, and so on and so on. Life is like a dream. Remember the monk, the head of the monastery, who said, look, this 13th century figure there, you know, that's me? Right? So dozens of reincarnations later, right, there he is and runs a monastery. How should you deal with this? First, non-attachment. Don't get attached to anything in particular in this world. Right? Put everything into perspective. If you're a Freudian psychologist, it would mean forget about the it, or ignore the it is perhaps better, and equally ignore the ego. Example, I asked people about self-esteem. The first problem I had, that many didn't understand the question. Right? If they did understand the question, they would say something, it's bad, because it attaches you to your ego. Today, there are schools in most villages, needless to say, schools in the capital, high schools, we're already there in 80, 81. Right? And a good number of Ladakhis are now sent to other places by their parents, if they have the money, or by some scholarship, usually in India, not so much Srinagar because of political problems and so on. Right? And the schooling, of course, will change things dramatically. Let me give you one example. At the walls of many Ladakhi houses, you used to see a ghost trap. Right? A ghost trap was meant quite literally. Right? It was sort of a concoction made from string, right? So almost like a little box. Right? And ghosts, as every Ladakhi knows, are curious creatures. So he wants to know what's in there. Right? A ghost is a dead person whose karma is keeping him as a ghost, right? At least for a while. Right? So the ghost goes in there, But, as every Ladakhi knows, ghosts cannot turn around. So he can't turn around there, and he's caught. Right? Smart. Now, the schools, of course, will not teach this. They will teach Indian curriculum, and there are no ghost traps in there. Right? So, on the one hand, Ladakh is a rather successful society. Right? And there's a certain pride among many young Ladakhis about their society. On the other hand, however, they also have to deal with the fact that their parents believe things like ghost traps is just one among many examples that isn't exactly convincing anymore. Right? So religion is changing. It loses some of these magic elements which are extremely influential in Tibetan Buddhism. I could tell you any number of stories about magical happenings. Right? Here's one. I went, they showed me a cave, and you saw in the cave sort of a depression which looked a little bit like a huge shoe print, about that size. Who left it here? Well, Padmasambhava, the founder of Tibetan Buddhism, right? 800 so-and-so. He was flying from Bhutan, 3,000 kilometers away, and landed here and meditated because it was a good cave to meditate. Right? Now, I think many of the younger Ladakhis might have their doubts about the story. Right? But in the old days, that would have been an entirely believable story. Right? If you're Chinese, well, every Tibetan knew that they're dragons, right? And they were taken seriously, and so on and so on. Secondly, the army. Most of the people in the army are not Ladakhis, right? They come from everywhere in India, even though Ladakhis now also serve in the army. It's, it's a rather poor place in many ways. An army needs huge amounts of supplies. For every soldier who fights, you have 10 or 20 supply people. In the American army, it's about 30 to 1. Right? So many Ladakhis now, one way or the other, work for the army. Some are soldiers, but others are somehow involved in the supply system. They become truck drivers. Sometimes when you're on the Srinagar road, you stand there for an hour while 50 trucks from the army pass you by. Right? Thirdly, tourism. Two types of tourism. One, mostly from Europe. Not many American tourists. Ladakh's much better known in Switzerland or Austria or Germany or France than in the United States. And Indian tourists. Right? There are now lots of honeymoon couples. Right? India now has a much bigger middle class than it used to have, and that would be a pretty interesting place to go for your honeymoon. In '77, there were 2 guest houses in Leh. In '81, there were 60 places where you could stay overnight. That's 4 years, including an Oberoi hotel. Oberoi is like a fancy Hilton, only better. Right? And so on and so on. Right? So tourism, according to one account I read, now is the biggest single source of cash income for Ladakhis. Thirdly, the mass media. For instance, in the late 70s, a movie house was set up in Leh. Now, the Ladakhis don't make movies. So what movies do they show? It's called Bollywood, the largest movie industry in the world, much bigger than Hollywood. Right? Now when you watch Bollywood movies, They're not like American movies. You know, there's a love story, then the young lady in a wet sari comes out of the river, right? Maybe a chaste kiss, right? Then they break out into song, right? And so on and so on. Well, you will say, so what? So now Ladakhis watch Bollywood, but that's a huge cultural change. You know, no wet saris in Ladakh. Ladakh is not a repressive society, sexually speaking, but you're supposed to dress properly. And all those European women in their shorts, hiking and so on, that's scandalous. So the mass media really points to two sources of globalization. One comes from India. Modernization doesn't mean westernization necessarily. Bollywood is not the West, right? So it's India on the one hand, but nowadays, of course, also globalization, the web, and so on. Example, I will finish in a few minutes, right? I'm in an obscure village in 1981, and there's a radio station in Ladakh. Right? I remember a description of this village back in the 60s. It was at the end of the world. The farmer whom we're interviewing has his radio on, and suddenly I hear, "Happy birthday to you," Navansering, and so on, right? So that is, of course, new, right? I'm not even sure birthdays would have been a big deal 10 or 20 years earlier, in English, please. Because English is the language of education in India, not just Ladakh, right? And so you have this little American ditty song, right? And many other examples. Economic opportunities, I already mentioned the army, tourism. One effect that this has is to undermine polyandry. Polyandry existed because of economic reasons, for no other reason. And I asked Ladakhis, why are you doing this? Why do you have a wife and 3 husbands? Right? And the answer was, well, it's a sacrifice for us. If we don't practice this, then we have to divide up the land. But there is so little land around that people can't live of it. Right? Once you have divided this up among 3 brothers, who can live of this little piece? Right? So these days, what do the brothers do? They become jeep drivers, bus drivers, they get an education, they become teachers, they get involved in trade, you name it. Okay? And they now can support their own wife. So, as an example, how things change, in fact, if you now go to Ladakh and you go to these farms, very often you see mostly women, some old people, and children. Where are the males? You know, the 25 or 30-year-old males. They are in Srinagar, in Delhi, they're on the road, they trade, they do whatever, right? And women have to now take care of a lot of things that they didn't have to take because they had a husband, after all, who was working in the fields. Last point. Let me just show you this picture for a moment. On the right hand, you see a monk. In the middle, this is a student from your college. She might look Indian to you, but she's actually Italian-American. Right? She's now a dean of behavioral science at your college, but at that time she was my research assistant. Right? On the left, here's the interpreter. Right? Now notice in the upper right-hand corner, who is looking down there at you? Bruce Lee. I didn't know he was a monk, but right. So some tourists brought this along to right above the head of the monk. I think this is the Oregon coast. Right. So you see this mixture, and this is 81. You know, I mean, this is not a recent picture. So that shows you some of the change. This is one of the this is the Dalai Lama. The picture hangs out there. Another monk. I want to show you this picture because it's also on the flyers. Right? On the left side, you see what the Ladakhis call an oracle or a shaman, a healer. Right? On her head, she has a so-called Buddha crown, indicating not only that she is under the protection of these Tibetan Buddhist gods, if that's the right word, but she also had to pass an examination under the control of other shamans and a couple of monks, right? That she's doing this properly. On the right-hand side, you see a young woman. Notice her headgear. She's a Muslim. The treatment is public. I'm sitting there. It was about 15 people, mostly Ladakhis, on a Sunday morning. That's the most famous oracle of all of Ladakh. And the woman on the right hand, her client, has complaint of chest pains. So the shaman is in trance. She's called a Lamo, a La, L-H-A, is a spirit or sort of a local deity, not one up there, but sort of like a lower ranking spirit, who inhabits her body and mind during this treatment. After the treatment, if you ask her what happened, she will say, I don't remember. Because if she would remember, she would be a fraud. Remember, she isn't there. It's the law that heals, not her. Okay? So the law acts through the body, mind of this Lamo, right? And she's sucking through this bamboo stick a sort of a evil poisonous substance. She will spit it on the floor in front of the patient, right? So it looks blackish, right? And says, that's the problem. That's the poison. She calls it the poison, right? And where that fluid comes from, of course, she wouldn't tell me. I think I know, but that's a professional secret, let's say. Right? And she will treat 10 people or so in this morning. She gets paid on a, we would call it a sliding fee scale, meaning whatever people can afford. And since everybody knows everybody, you can't be a cheapie. Right? But it would be, in those days, 15 rupees, it would have been $2 or whatever, a certain amount of money for the local people. Again, a treatment. This time the client is a Buddhist woman. You can see this from the way she's dressed, right? The Lamo has in her right hand a Vajra, which translates as thunderbolt, is a male symbol of compassion, sort of active interventionist compassion. Right? The female symbol, incidentally, is a bell, which represents sort of enlightenment. Right? So she's rubbing this Vajra on the back of the client, who has her hands folded, right, in prayer. Right? A Vajra represents power, compassionate power, healing power. Right? So that's also a healing ritual. A third Lama, who incidentally also was a nun, right, during a healing ritual. Right? So it's taking place in her kitchen, where Ladakhis usually meet because that's the warm place, especially in the wintertime. Right? She's in trance, as you can see. Interestingly enough, she told me that it's getting harder to reach trance as you get older. That's a Ladakhi theory, right? That when you're younger, it's easier to reach trance, and as she gets older, it's harder to do. Right? She's not as well known as the Lamo in the previous two pictures. Right? And this is taken during an exorcism ritual. Right? This is a scene. A young woman in her 30s, I would guess, came to her. Her son had died at the age of 5 or 6 about half a year ago. And the ghost of the son was haunting her dreams. A ghost is a non-pacified survival of a person. And it's numptious, which translates as something like consciousness. Right? So the purpose of the ritual was to pacify the ghost of the son, because a ghost is always driven by some unfinished business, by some karmic business. Right? So at the end of the ritual, the Lamo forms a little statue made often from dough. Right? And that represents the son. Then she speaks to the statue and tells him to leave his mother alone, right, to find peace. The statue will be buried a little bit away from the house of the client, right, to sort of symbolically remove the problems, and hopefully he will find peace and not bother his mother anymore. Now, I'm trained by training psychologist, and even though I'm certainly not a clinician, that sort of, I know a little bit about indigenous healing, and needless to say, when do you ever get an opportunity to witness exorcism? Right? It wasn't dramatic the way, the Exorcist type movies do it, and the little girl spits up pea soup or whatever it was, and so on and so on. Right? Ladakhi culture is sort of like a quiet culture in many ways, but it was serious business. Right? I don't know what the success of it was. The client was not a Ladakhi. She was actually from Nepal. And interestingly enough, the Lamo, the shaman, accused the client that she really didn't believe in this ritual. Where she got that idea from, I don't know. It's rather unusual. It probably had something to do with the fact that the Nepali woman probably was not a Buddhist. Right? In Nepal there is Buddhism, but most people are Hindu. Right? That she was from obviously an outsider. Right? But I'm guessing around. Maybe there was some other reason why she believed this. Right? In recent years, more and more women have become Lamos. A male is called a La Pa. Pa is a male person. A Mo is a woman. Right? And it used to be about 3 to 2, 3 and 1.5 times as many men as women. But now there are far more women who claim to be a Lamo than in the past. Why? Well, we have only guesses, but I think one guess is that there are now many women whose husbands, brothers, and so on are somewhere else, meaning they're working, but sometimes for months, and they're under a lot of stress. Whether that's a good explanation, I don't know, but maybe there's something else. But it's quite striking that you see this shift. Again, a very surprising example of modernization. You think modernization means fewer of these Lamo, right? More modern doctors, of whom there are now a bunch in Ladakh. Right? Ladakhis are not stupid. They will go to a hospital to give birth because they noticed that in the old days lots of kids died. Child mortality rates at the end of World War II in the 40s and 50s were probably somewhere around 50%. Nobody knows for sure. Half of all kids. As was true in Europe if you would have walked around in the 1600s. Bach had 20 children, 10 died. And he was upper middle class, he had plenty of doctors. Right? So people said, you know, these local doctors called Amchi, they don't know how to fight all these demons that kill our children. Let's go to a hospital, give birth there. Apparently, those modern doctors who often don't speak Ladakhi know what they're doing. Right? So, the point here is probably a lot of the problems that the Lama deals with are psychological problems that a doctor from India cannot deal with. A, he doesn't believe in this stuff. B, he doesn't speak the language. Right? So they become more psychologically oriented, if that's the right word. Right? And for certain other problems, people now go to the hospital or modern doctors. All these are little examples of how the world in Ladakh is changing. Last example, in the year 2000, some of the young men had blue jeans on. Even though in 77 I saw many elderly men and women who were making their own cloth, even spinning. Right. So I'm not very happy to see these guys in blue jeans, frankly speaking, right? But it does tell you something about outside influences, in this case from the US. Right? I know it's a little bit long. I thank you very much for your attention. There should be some food outside. Right? And if you want to ask me specific questions about some of these photographs, I will be available. Thank you.